now. So for those who are joining us, attendees, as you can see, we've got the chat function open. Leah Galvin has already said hello. So just invite you to introduce yourself and say where you're joining us from today and what drew you to the webinar. And if you want to share relevant links and so on, please, please feel free to do that. However, we are going to commence now. So good morning and a very warm welcome to you all, wherever you may be joining us from on this Wednesday morning, 2nd of December, in this extraordinary year that has been 2020. My name is Nick Rose and I'm the Executive Director of Sustain, the Australian Food Network, a national not-for-profit organisation and registered health promotion charity whose mission is to design and build better food systems and in so doing advance human and ecological health and flourishing. On behalf of the board and staff of Sustain, I acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. We respectfully acknowledge the custodianship of the elders, recognising that they and their ancestors stewarded these lands and their diverse creatures sustainably for tens of thousands of years. We respectfully acknowledge that sovereignty over these lands was never ceded, and the process of historical truth-telling that will and must lead to justice for all First Nations peoples on the basis of a duly negotiated treaty is an urgent task for all Australians. I further wish to acknowledge and pay my respects to all First Nations peoples who may be with us this morning or who may be watching this subsequently. So now it's my great honour and privilege to hand over to Oral Maguire, Chairperson of Noongar Land Enterprise Group, who has generously agreed to do us the great honour of welcoming us to Noongar Budja. Oral.
Lovely, thank you, Nick, and good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be across the globe. Welcome to the forum on this day or night, and I, on behalf of everyone, thank you, Nick, for the opportunity to welcome everybody to the tribal and traditional lands of the families and clan groups of our 300 or so First Nations, First World Nations of Australia, the Aboriginal and Indigenous groups. So on behalf of my mob here in Noongar country, the Southwest, I'm sitting here on my mother's and father's country of Baladong Budja, and in our language we say Wanju, 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 Nganjurup, Nunuk Nitja Wartholin, Karingan Nganwang, Nwang, Nitja Ngala Budja. Ngala Budja, Ngala Ngaka Budja, Ngala Budja, Nitja Burdawan Budja. Nunaka Kala Kulin, Burdawan Balapa, Weird, Kurd. So what I said was, yeah, welcome to the lands and the tribal lands of all of our peoples in Australia. These lands are our sacred lands. They're, in language we say, this land is our mother. It sustains us, it keeps us. It's always been a part of our spirit and part of our sense of who we are as a people. So it's our identity and it is us. I also said that we call on our spirits of our old people, our grandmothers and our grandfathers, to be with us wherever we may sit and bless the opportunity for us to join together as one mob. And later on, we ask that after we finish this forum, that your spirits travel slowly on the lands on which you may be. So thank you, Nick, and enjoy the forum.
Thanks so much, Oral. That was truly wonderful and a real privilege for myself, and I'm sure for everybody here. I speak on behalf of us all that yeah, feel deeply honoured to have received that welcome. Thank you very much. So as a sustainable food systems organisation and expanding national network, Sustain and our partners understand that the wicked problems we face across the food system, from the loss of soil fertility and biodiversity to the growing burden of dietary related ill health and disease, are incapable of quick or easy resolution. They are systemic and structural problems that have accumulated over decades and centuries, have become institutionally embedded in legal and regulatory frameworks, and are reinforced by concentrations of political economic power. Changing this dynamic, this paradigm, is not simple. We are convinced that it requires whole of system, long-term and collaborative approaches involving dozens, if not hundreds of actors united by a shared vision and agenda for change. That is why we have been deeply interested in and inspired by the Vermont Farm to Plate plan for many years as a leading example globally of where such a method of working has been successfully designed, implemented, evaluated, and documented. We were thrilled when about 15 months ago, Jake Claro agreed to come to Australia in March this year for a national tour to share the lessons and achievements of the first 10 years of the Vermont Farm to Plate plan for audiences across the country, interested in understanding its relevance and applicability for the Australian context. Of course, those plans were sideswiped by the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, as we all know, the pandemic has dramatically revealed the fragility and inequities that characterise global and national food systems, with all the economic hardship and suffering that has already occurred and will continue to intensify in the coming weeks and months. So this series of webinars, Planning for Sustainable and Secure Food and Farming Systems, commencing today and continuing on the 9th and 16th of December, exploring land use planning, food access and food security, and the role of public procurement as a lever for food systems change, could not be more timely or important. Of the 430 people that have already registered for today's webinar and the next two, over 100 are from state and local governments, as well as the health and natural resource management sectors. We have dozens of producers, business owners, researchers, teachers, and community members as registered attendees. Today, we will hear from Jake primarily, and also Sarah, about the origins, history, achievements, and lessons of the Farm to Plate plan for about 40 minutes. Then we'll have 3 10-minute presentations from colleagues in Tasmania, Western Australia, and Victoria, followed by about 40 minutes of questions and discussion. Please use the Q&A function to submit your question and indicate if there is a particular presenter to whom it is directed. I would invite you also to use the chat function now to introduce yourself, where you are joining us from, and what drew you to this webinar. This webinar series would not have been possible without the generous support of our partners and supporters. Since there are nearly 24 of them, I will not read them all out by name. However, you can see them all on the screen now. I'd also like to particularly thank the dozens of Sustain members who are joining us today. Your support for and belief in our work matters enormously to us, and we are hugely grateful for it. If you are not a member of Sustain but like what we do and would like to support us, I'd encourage you to consider becoming a member. Amongst other benefits, all our webinars are free for our members. I'd also like to acknowledge and express my gratitude and thanks for the work of our staff, particularly Ariana Lim and Georgia Caravis, who have done a lot of the heavy lifting in coordinating and facilitating and organising this webinar series. So a big thank you to both. And now it is my very great pleasure to introduce you all to Jake Claro and Sarah Danley. So Jake is the Farm to Plate Director at the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, and he's responsible for providing facilitative leadership and strategic coordination to the Farm to Plate Network's work to implement Vermont's food system plan. He manages the Farm to Plate team at the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund and works to align activity among 350 stakeholders and increase collaboration between the private sector, non-profits and government to strengthen Vermont's farm and food economy for the benefit of all Vermonters. Sarah Danley joined the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund as the Farm to Plate Network Manager in 2017. She provides support to several Farm to Plate Network groups and other projects, including the tracking of goals and indicators for the Farm to Plate Food System Plan. Sarah previously worked at the Centre for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School as a program officer, a role that combined project management with research and creation of legal resources. And just like on behalf of Sustain and all of us here today, I express our gratitude and appreciation to Jake and Sarah for making themselves available in the evening right now and over the next 2 Wednesdays to share the accumulated experience and knowledge with us. It's of great interest to us here in Australia. So thank you very much indeed. A very warm welcome to Australia. We're sorry that you can't be here with us physically in person, but it's great that we can be present together in this way. So now I'll hand over to you, Jake. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Nick. Can everyone hear me all right? Or at least people that I can see? Okay. Yeah, it seems like ages ago that I was planning on coming to Australia in March. And so it is a pleasure to at least be able to share some of our learnings with you all today. And I do want to first, a big thank you to Sustain. As someone who's usually on the other end of something like this, I know all of the work that goes into it, and am super appreciative of that. And yeah, and just a real pleasure to be here tonight, or today. So is my screen shared right now or no? Okay. So hold on 1 second. And how about now? All right, here we go. So a lot of ground to cover. I might be swift in certain sections, but there's a lot to share, and hopefully I feel like this is maybe the beginning of what will be hopefully some future occasions for us to share what we're developing right now in the second iteration of Farm to Plate. So let's get going. So I think it's good manners to kind of introduce myself, but also introduce my state and give a little context for just a little sense of kind of where we're coming from, what Vermont is, and maybe share a little context too of what it is in relation to Australia. So here are the 3 locations that I was planning to primarily spend my time in March. So you can see there's Vermont in comparison to Western Australia, Eastern Australia, and Tasmania. And we're a small state, so about 624,000 people, GDP or GSP, gross state product of 32.5 billion, median household income 60,000, 11% persons in poverty. Vermont has a very large civilian labor force, just something to take note of, and maybe contributes to some of the culture around Farm to Plate that I'll be sharing. So that's significant at 65.7% of our labor force. This statistics isn't quite as relevant anymore in the age of COVID, but we are a rural state, so we have some longer commute times to work at 22.9 minutes. And then kind of from an ag perspective, just very broadly, there's about 6,800 farms in Vermont. And kind of the farm gate ag product sales, sort of the raw sales, are $781 million of market value. And so that's not including any kind of value added additional products. So before I get into kind of the depth of Farm to Plate, I think I just want to establish very broadly and briefly as we're going through this, kind of what it is in a general sense. And so in a general sense, kind of the quick version is that Farm to Plate is our legislatively enabled food system plan. And kind of its basic legislative outcomes are centered around increasing economic development in the food and farm sectors, and then also increasing access to local food for all Vermonters. And this, I won't be able to get into the details of how this is changing a little bit in the next kind of the next 10 years with reauthorization of Farm to Plate. But just know that I'm talking about sort of what is kind of defined in the first 10 years of Farm to Plate. And then the network is basically the entities that are working together to implement the plan. And so that's now over 350 organizations working on these 25 goals that are outlined in the first strategic plan. So another just quick note is that collective impact is a big part of what we kind of an influence on how we do things. And I'll be referencing some of these terms, so I think it's good just to establish this up front, that when we talk about a common agenda, that is our strategic plan. Mutually reinforcing activities are kind of happening through our network. So that kind of coordinated strategic action that is meant to reach the goals of the plan. Continuous communication is accomplished through various platforms that we have, namely our website, and then we have various network groups have their own listservs, and of course social media and other kind of means of communicating what's happening in the network, what's happening in the food system in Vermont. So the organization that I work for, the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, provides what is known as backbone support in the collective impact lexicon. And so that's, we're very much providing an administrative capacity, project management, funding, coordination, facilitation, etc. And then we do have a shared measurement system known as results-based accountability. I don't know how sort of well known outside of kind of the United States this system is, but basically kind of the essential aspect is that we try to show population level indicators, track progress over time with those, but also look at performance measures of the work that we do. And the questions that we ask around that are, what are we doing? How well are we doing it? And is anyone better off? So that's very much built into a lot of the work that we do. And then we've added, this is actually, the sixth one is not a official condition of collective impact, but we've kind of determined that it's absolutely necessary, is funding. You really can't, you can't do this type of work without substantial backing from philanthropy and other sources. And we would also note that governance is another kind of component of this that's really essential. So how are decisions made? Who's making them? Where does leadership lie? Things like that. Okay, so I'm going to try to cover this story in 5 acts in the spirit of being informative, but also maybe entertaining. So just to give you a quick kind of overview, Act 1 is why farm to plate? Like what's kind of the rationale for this? Act 2 is how did it come together? Act 3 is some key successes that I'd like to share that kind of are emblematic, I think, of the kind of approach and way in which the network has accomplished things. Act 4 is just a quick, I'm probably going to cover this very quickly, is key challenges as we were looking ahead to the next 10 years, and also some things that have come up in the first 10 years. And then Act 5 is the final reflections and lessons learned. Okay, so here we go. Act 1, why farm to plate? This is very much kind of a story of parallel universes, and I sort of somewhat jokingly call it this, but I think it's actually emblematic of some things that are still with us. So kind of the beginnings of farm to plate, the context is there's a crisis and there's emergent excitement. So what's the crisis? It's that in 2009, Vermont's dairy industry, which is the largest ag industry in the state, both in terms of sales value and land use, experienced a historic price decline with cost of production in some months more than 100% more than the pay price that our dairy farmers were receiving. And so that's, you can kind of see the graphic on the left is the milk price, and the arrow there is pointing at 2009 where there's that dip. And then you can see substantial losses per cow as well in that year. And so this also just occurred soon after low prices in 2006 struck the industry. So you've got an industry that has little time in between for debt repayment, and the crash forced many dairy farms out of business. And then the emergent excitement, kind of the other side of this that's happening at the same time, is that the local food movement is taking off. People are really excited about agriculture and food in a new way. We've got these award-winning artisan products like the cheeses up top. We've got new food hubs. So you can see the Intervale Food Hub there, Crew, that's delivering food directly to people in new ways. On the bottom is Greg Durgaklis of Farmers to You, which delivers basically kind of CSAs to communities in Boston through an online sales platform. And then on the bottom left is at the time, our governor celebrating the opening of a new incubation space for basic value-added meat products. So there's all of these new models and enterprises that are starting to kind of come about around the same time. And also there's a real sense of community engagement that's really beginning to kind of gain momentum. So farmers markets are growing, including winter markets. Farm to school programs are exposing classes to ag, integrating food and ag into the curriculum. Gleaning programs are creating partnerships between farms, nonprofits, and the community. So you have this situation where there's all this there's all this energy and excitement, but it's contrasted with this major industry that's in crisis, that gave rise, and it's giving rise to a disconnect amongst policymakers and funders in particular, and a major question of, how do we make sense of what's happening, and what are the right ways to intervene and invest? So basically there's no plan, there's not enough coordination, and funders and legislators need guidance. So the philanthropic community in particular was wondering if they were investing in the right areas, if there was redundancy to how they're investing, and how greater collaboration could be created to improve outcomes and impacts. And as they started to come together as a network, they're realizing that they're funding some of the same projects without even knowing it, and asking kind of questions of why that is, and are we really maximizing our efficacy here? So again, that's kind of the context. You've got this crisis, you've got this emergent excitement, you've got people looking, important kind of policymakers and funders looking for guidance. So how does then Farm to Plate emerge out of this? And so there are some additional key moments and players in the lead up to the plan. In addition to the legislature and funding community, there's an organization in Vermont called the Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility that was in the process of identifying public policies that they could focus on, or that their members should be focusing on. And they were duly motivated by a report that came out around this time called the Vermont Job Gap Study, which documented the state's heavy reliance on imports and flows of capital that were leaving the state, and how that could be converted into economic development opportunities in state. So there's that kind of interest and kind of questioning that's happening amongst the membership of this organization. And so they identify food systems as an area of growing interest and potential for socially responsible economic development. And their policy committee came out with a set of recommendations, which included an eye for developing a strategic plan, a statewide strategic plan. And then their interest was further buoyed by an organization called Rural Vermont, which is a very kind of legislatively active group funded in the 80s by founded in the 80s by dairy farmers, with a mission to advocate for community scale agriculture. And they too were interested in having a statewide strategic plan that would prioritize local ag development, and particularly with kind of that duality of the crisis and the opportunities that they were seeing amongst their membership. So the 2009 legislative session is then defined by this confluence of interests coming from a diversity of stakeholders. So you've got a socially responsible business association, a farm advocacy group representing the kind of what many see as like the cultural identity of Vermont agriculture and small scale farms, and then legislators with an interest in giving state agencies and policymakers greater strategic direction. And then of course, philanthropic funders who are wanting more kind of collaboration and intentionality behind the projects that they're funding. One second. And so this then leads to the actual passing of the enabling legislation of the Farm to Plate investment program, is what it's known as, sort of in statute. And this was passed in 2009, making it the first legislatively enabled statewide food system plan in the country. And the primary goals, as I kind of alluded to, increasing the economic development, creating jobs in the food and farm economy, improving access to healthy local foods. So as we kind of like to joke is that it's mandated here, the objectives, but there's a lot of room to improvise, because those three things cover a broad swath of activities and things that we could possibly invest in and kind of create strategic direction for. So as a recovering philosophy major, I'm always interested in the existential questions. And so I would be remiss not to ask it of why us? Why VSJF? So essentially we were seen as a neutral entity. So we did not have a history of kind of advocacy-based approaches around issues of agriculture. So there was definitely some well-established organizations in Vermont that have a lot of influence and still do, but they carried a certain agenda and represented a subset basically of the agricultural community. So the legislature was very interested in looking to kind of a neutral entity to carry this forward. And they also had, I think, the foresight to want to kind of put it outside of state government. There was an election coming up, a change in administration. So they really wanted to kind of protect this from administrative changes. And at the same time, we were going through a recession in 2009. So basically the state budget and what the Agency of Agriculture could take on was very limited. So there was also just an interest in if this were to be sustainable from a funding perspective, it's likely that it was going to have to be outside of state government at kind of the onset. Okay, so some quick things about how kind of the actual plan was developed. So we had a project team that was put together to advise the process, consult on approach to developing the plan and stakeholder engagement, reviewing drafts and content. And we were really looking for big picture thinkers, people who could represent more than just their organizational perspectives, but also people with credibility and kind of the gravitas to attract others to legitimacy of the final product. And we also included 5 farmers as part of this team who were receiving stipends and travel reimbursement for their time. And the team as a whole was essential basically to ground truthing the process, the data, the research, and the findings, and kind of putting it into the right framing and context given their experience and knowledge. And the basic kind of approach of the plan is based around this soil-to-soil model. So the team said, look, let's start with farm inputs, and then let's go from there. Let's look at all of the different elements of the food system as it moves from production to processing to distribution to retail outlets and institutions. Let's examine consumer behaviors and demand, and then let's look at how does food then get managed as a nutrient and kind of put back into the cycle. So that's kind of the underlying philosophy and approach of the plan. And then it's also, our plan really puts an emphasis on kind of synthesizing these 3 elements of, getting public engagement, getting that kind of on the ground experience injected into the plan, pairing that with strong quantitative analysis of national and state data. And then also we ran some economic impact assessments using REMI to sort of add an additional layer of legitimacy around kind of the economics of what we were proposing to do. And so here's just a kind of a picture of an example of one of the stakeholder sessions. Over 1,200 Vermonters were engaged. That includes seven regional summits and a statewide summit, a lot of one-on-one interviews, and also a number of focus groups to vet goals, objectives, and strategies. And here's kind of just an example of basically the quantitative analysis also gave us this framework for shared measurement. As we were collecting this data, as we were visually presenting it and showing kind of the baseline, we were then creating an opportunity to show whether or not change was going in the right direction or not. So this is very much the basis of our metrics system. And then just a quick note on the REMI projections is that, so the REMI model said based on assuming a 5% increase in consumption of Vermont food in Vermont, that this would increase food sector employment by 1,500 jobs. And this is interestingly sort of wildly conservative estimate. We've totally surpassed those estimates. And when you put all this together, that's we get the plan. So you put the qualitative, quantitative, and the REMI together, and you've got our common agenda that guides our coordinated, mutually reinforcing activities. So this is the cover of the first Farm to Place strategic plan. Okay, I'm actually moving at a pretty good pace. So key successes. So I think what I'll do with these is, kind of giving individual cases, but try to draw out to kind of some universal elements of these. I think it's really actually important to say that the plan itself is a real key success. And there's some things that came about very quickly from putting the plan out, and actually and the process of creating the plan. So it inspired some new businesses, and it also inspired the Agency of Agriculture to bring on new staff that was specifically focused on local food development and coordination. So I mentioned Greg Drogaklis of Farmers to You. He was a contributor to the plan, and in writing it realized, wow, there's this huge gap for farms in being able to kind of aggregate product and bring it to metropolitan markets. And he saw that then as a business opportunity and created Farmers to You. And it's still around to this day and doing quite well. They've seen some really significant sales increases actually during the pandemic. Vermont Bean Crafters is another, Joe Bosson, who's the founder. What he realized was that he was interested in getting into farming. And what he realized in reading the plan was that Vermont doesn't need more farmers. Vermont needs businesses that can give farms an outlet to create value-added products. And so he created Bean Crafters, which does bean burgers and kind of value-added processed bean products. And they also do kind of bulk beans for institutional sales as well. So he created this business that then opened up a lot of opportunity for other farms that were interested in growing beans in Vermont. And then the Mad River Food Hub, Robin Morris, he realized that through one of the sections of the plan that identified some meat processing capacity gaps, that again, he was an entrepreneur in his past life, and he saw that as a very clear opportunity and created the Food Hub, which was based around meat processing. And also, and importantly though, with a missions-based value of incubating more Vermont food processing businesses. So here are the goals. I'm not going to obviously go through them. There's 25 of them, but the importance of establishing these goals is that it created a language for our funding sources to identify and understand strategic value of proposals. So we've got a number of now grant funds, whether they're state-based or philanthropic, that ask applicants to identify goal alignment, and there's a review process that tries to kind of examine whether or not the proposal is aligning with strategic priorities from the plan. So it's very much used as a filter for making funding decisions, which, I mean, it also imbues a lot of power in a sense to creating these goals, which I've sort of come to in the second iteration of developing another plan. We've thought a lot of, we're giving a lot more attention right now to racial equity and issues of equity in our goal process, because it's not necessarily explicitly defined here, and we're seeing that that sends a strong signal then of priority, and so these goals really have become a very strong piece of shared language and kind of setting signals for both funders and for policymakers. And then, of course, the plan actually provides the foundation and rationale for creating the Farm to Plate network. So the network launched in 2011, and it's built around the leverage points in the food system that emerged through the plan development. And the goals and recommendations of the plan are used as a foundation for the groups to set priorities, determine projects, or sort of examine knowledge gaps within the system that they need to address. And this is, so the inner ring of the blue ring is what we call working groups. The outer kind of purple ring is our cross-cutting teams. And then in the center, although it's centralized, it's not sort of a centralized decision-making entity, is our steering committee, which is made up of representatives of these groups. So we have, each of these groups is chaired or co-chaired by an elected person, and they then are represented in the steering committee. All right. So then the second, I think, early stage success right off the bat too is that we really strongly made, by using a lot of kind of the quantitative elements and the economic modeling is that we made a strong case that food system development and local food system development is economic development. We began to be able to kind of quantify this for the legislature and others in a way that hadn't been done before. And really what we wanted to do is we wanted to answer three basic questions over time periodically, and that was, we wanted to be able to tell legislators what's the total economic output of the local food system, how many people work in the food system in Vermont, and what is the value of local food purchased in Vermont. And if we use this traditional kind of economic development language, we can get our foot in the door, we can put food systems in the discussion and get more people to see it as a larger system and not just limited to what's happening at the farm, even though what's happening at the farm is very obviously essential and foundational. And then we can also, in doing that, introduce this more social and environmental components as well. So just a little kind of nuts and bolts of it is that we use what are called NAICS codes, which my understanding is it's the equivalent of, I'm not going to try to pronounce it as an acronym, but it's ANZSIC to graph employment over time, and in turn help people visualize in totality the types of employment and economic activity represented by food systems. And our employment in our food system right now is roughly around 65,000 people. It's increased by over 6,500 jobs from 2010 to now. And I just circled kind of the two areas that, you know, people, when we would talk about, you know, if we talked about this 10 or 11 years ago, you know, agriculture or food systems, they would think of it as it's farm operators and hired farm workers. Like that's the agricultural economy. And we've gotten people now out of that kind of confined way of thinking about food system development. And then we also created a methodology to track local purchasing within Vermont over time. And so as these graphs kind of demonstrate, when we started, we had estimated that local food purchases in Vermont, you know, within the state of Vermont were about $114 million. And that was about 5% of food purchases in the state. And now that is by last estimate, we're doing this again this year, is 310 million, which is 13.9% of total Vermont food purchases. So some really incredible growth. And again, just the ability to kind of quantify this and create a methodology for it was a big kind of advance in helping advance food system kind of issues and elevating it in conversations, particularly at the legislature. And then there's kind of an example there of just we try to categorize it by different market outlets, and then we have another kind of instance of looking at by product categories to see kind of changes over time in consumer behavior as to like what they're purchasing. Okay. And last kind of example of this is just that this is a Vermont marketing campaign trying to attract people to the state. And this is a screenshot of the website. And that food, beverage, and consumer goods is a kind of a thing that they would have never have tried to emphasize 10 years ago before this work had started. So really the state now has fully embraced kind of this notion and trying to promote it as one of the key attributes of Vermont. How am I doing on time? Because I meant to start a timer, but
you're doing great, Jake. You've probably got another 10, 12 minutes, something like that.
Okay, great, perfect. I think we're on track. So now just a couple of pieces about network success and kind of how this fits into the story so far. First one is increasing meat processing capacity. So there was this widely held assumption that Vermont needed more slaughterhouses, and a task force, a meat processing task force, came together, and that represented government agencies, farmers, processors, and they realized that assumption was flawed. That really the problem was that there was a lack of processing space, and that processors were burdened by basically an influx of fall bookings for their capacity. So they realized that there was this need to improve business management of existing facilities, to improve relationships between producers and processors. So a lot of kind of unsaid ill will, if you will, between producers and processors about, oh, they won't, they do this wrong, or they won't let me do this or that, and not really understanding kind of the business side of each other's of operations. And then also trying to help identify where new investments should go to increase capacity in a strategic way. So they first started by doing some financial analysis of our processors in the state. And in doing so, they revealed that, our processors were highly undercapitalized, their operating margins were thin, debt was significant, skilled labor was tough to find and retain. And so what they wanted to do, what they did then from there, is that they helped processors receive matching grants and capital for improvements to their infrastructure. So they kind of did a lot of the legwork of identifying these gaps for the processors in the state, and then by the nature of the composition of the group, including funders and agency staff and other support organizations, they were able to pair those businesses with the kind of needed funding and capital to improve their businesses. They also worked on social gatherings between farmers and processors to improve those relations. So a number of kind of events that brought those two communities together in new and unique ways. And also they did a number of learning journeys. So they brought members of the team out to a facility in Minnesota where they saw a mid-sized meat processing facility and kind of saw how to run a facility of that scale successfully. They also did some trips to Italy, and they also brought some people to Vermont to kind of tour the state, look at the facilities, and share their knowledge. And through that, one of the members of the group, Black River Produce, actually kind of gained the confidence to invest in a building and create a new processing facility. And from there as well, processing capacity in general in Vermont increased significantly from kind of the work and learnings of the task force. So the second one is normalizing local purchasing in institutions. So before this, not to say that local food purchasing wasn't happening in institutions, but it wasn't happening kind of in this standardized way, a very kind of systems approach. And so what the network did was really focused on one particular food service provider, which serves the majority of our college campuses, Sodexo. And they held what they call a scaling up forum. So they brought Sodexo and their supply management team together with a number of intermediaries, food hubs and the Agency of Agriculture and other local food organizations who have kind of connections to the farming community. And then they also brought in some producers who had been pre-screened a bit to determine like how serious they were in kind of wanting to sell into institutions and their ability to do that. And so that event went really well, and it created a successful model that the healthcare community as well started to adopt. And also Sodexo itself then kind of was starting to receive some signals that this was going to be an important part of their future of operating in Vermont. So they were renegotiating their contract with the state. They saw that there was this interest in local procurement. The Agency of Ag was very emphatic about it. And so they understood that they had a gap in being able to facilitate these kind of local relationships with suppliers, with farmers and value-added producers. And so they created this program called Vermont First, and they actually now have a full staff person who coordinates the program, who tracks local procurement and develops relationships with local producers to increase Sodexo's local procurement. So that was a huge kind of shift in a multinational company putting real investment in a local coordination position through this kind of process of helping them kind of see that was something that was missing in their own kind of management of supply in the state and in the region. And now that program, Vermont First, has been replicated in Maine as well. And I think I want to say Massachusetts is kind of coming around as well too. And I'll just let's see. Yeah, I'll go on. There's more things that happen in kind of the healthcare sector that reflect similar kind of changes. So another area is independent retail. So retail is a significant opportunity for local. There's a lot of focus on institutions for good reason, but some in the network were wondering, why not retail? This is a huge, huge market. So estimated $750 million of sales that are happening in these small independent retailers in Vermont. Task force was created to kind of do some initial research, ground truth assumptions about local purchasing and the needs of store owners. And they did this in 2 phases of research. So they first went in, assessed local purchasing within the stores of different sizes and geographic locations, and asked questions about demand for local products and the kind of challenges that these stores had in getting local products into stores. And then a second phase was conducted once that opportunity, that it was clear there was an opportunity and there was demand, that they were looking more at ways in which stores would like to receive assistance in bringing in more local food. So they were asking questions about, do you want to do online, in person, in groups, webinar? What's kind of your preferred way of training? And what kind of assistance do you actually need? And so that info allowed us to build out an actual retail technical assistance program that has multiple touch points. So there's a series of educational videos, which we call Take Fives. There's printable worksheets and exercises for staff to do. And then there's direct in-store trainings that happen. And since that program started, it has evolved considerably. So now there's a bi-weekly newsletter that goes out to these retailers that identifies both local products that they might be interested in, but also the distributors that they can work with to procure those products. There's all sorts of like local marketing and merchandising recommendations that come through this. And also prior to COVID, we were starting to do more kind of meetups and forums with buyers, distributors, producers, and also some more kind of advanced and intensive 1 to 2 day workshops for retailers focused on local food procurement. And we were looking to evolve this to small kind of farm cohorts and doing kind of also like farm stand trainings with a retail orientation. And I think, so these 3 kind of examples here are really, I think, good cases of, bringing the diversity of stakeholders together, that, it is about public and private sector kind of finding common ground, common purpose, and especially kind of at a smaller scale, a lot of these businesses need help, and it's that first initial kind of reaching out sometimes that makes them kind of recognize that, yeah, I could use these services, and maybe I wasn't asking for them, but I see the value. And then from there, a lot of really incredible kind of openings come about from that. And this is kind of, I almost feel like this is quaint for an Australian audience of grass-fed beef sector development, but I think it's you could sort of think about this for any like product area that's kind of nascent in your context. Grass-fed beef in Vermont is kind of a nascent industry. And so really just the main points here is that, and what we tried to do was, and in a lot of these cases, is pair some initial research. So we looked at, there was 2 separate reports, market research, and then some profitability kind of production research. And we used that to figure out what our producers needed. We brought a school to the state, or to the Northeast, that had never been to the Northeast, called Ranching for Profit, which there was an Australian participant in this cohort. And this was really kind of an intensive kind of business school for grass-based producers. And then in doing this program, if you've made it through, we paired it with grant funds. So then those producers applied for funding based on what they identified as their kind of strategic business needs. So this was a great kind of example of kind of building from research to some technical assistance to then giving some funding that's very strategically deployed based on their learnings and kind of reflections of participating in the program. So I'm going to try to move fast and get to the lessons learned. And then just another kind of, I think, good example of just the diversity of things that we're doing is also comprehensive municipal and regional food system planning. Sarah is going to talk more about this next Wednesday, so I won't kind of steal. I'll make this is a good preview to get interest for that. And just to say that there was sort of 5 of these developed, 5 modules that were developed initially, and then recently there was a local planning for food access module that was kind of added to that. And it's brought about some really interesting partnerships and I think new memberships of the network, new energy, kind of new interests that has been really great to see. Okay, key challenges, I'm gonna like fly by this. So basically farm viability, farms of all types, struggle to make a living. It's not just dairy that, is kind of finding it hard. So that's just an important thing for all of us to recognize is sort of it's a tough business. It's a tough thing to do in a profitable way. And especially kind of in an industrial globalized context. Marketing distribution. So if you do want to sell in a non-direct way, this was an example of a pint of tomatoes, retail, $4.89. The producer is basically going to see $1.38 of that. So they're getting 28% of the suggested retail price, and that's pretty consistent, probably across many different types of products. So contributing to the farm viability conundrum. Farmland access, so we've got very aging kind of demographic in the farm community, and and just needing more youth, more people to kind of take this on in the next generation, and just when you're talking about significant land assets that are in control of these farms that are kind of aging. It's becoming a very kind of difficult situation, and could become a crisis of its own if not addressed in a significant way soon. Workforce development, both in terms of kind of entry level positions, but also management. There's just a need to kind of to I think create a sense of opportunity for food system occupations, because again, not a lot of people think about kind of the different ways in which you can be a part of the food system that's not just being a farmer. And so that's something we've tried to work on as well. And then I think climate change in the environment is unavoidable, and just like the 800-pound gorilla in the room. And for Vermont specifically, kind of seeing a lot of very significant heavy precipitation events, and then huge kind of lags of drought. So the actual like average precipitation is going up, but the water availability over the full growing season is sporadic, or more sporadic than it typically would be. And then food access and food security is just another issue that's, I think we have some amazing entities, organizations in Vermont that work on this, but there's huge kind of structural economic issues that surround it that we're starting to kind of dive into. And then you get into healthcare and transportation. These are systems that operate, very kind of outside of our traditional purview of food systems. So this is something that we're looking towards in the next 10 years as well. All right. So key takeaways kind of for network establishment and funding is understand where the authority lies to do the work over the long haul, and then leverage it. So a lot of people kind of point to the fact that, Vermont, oh, that's really unique that you have it's legislatively enabled, and we certainly lean on that. But also that came from the grassroots, that came from organizations that were calling for it. And so that's also something that I think we emphasize and really lean into as well. So, our sort of authority is coming not only from the legislature, but it's coming from the entities that were calling for a need for coordination. And with that, we take that message very seriously. And we've tried to turn that into then kind of long-term commitments with the legislature and in our partnerships with the Agency of Agriculture. And of course, with that, with the funding community, then you need sufficient multi-year funding. And I think as well that it always amazes me that, like Jeff Bezos can sort of lose, and Amazon can lose, billions of dollars year over year in the promise that we're going to be profitable. And it's very hard sometimes to get the funding community, to say, well, we need 3 years of funding to establish kind of the relationships that are going to make this network work for the long term. And so that's just something that, it's kind of how to present it and convince people that, that initial kind of investment is going to have returns in future years. And it's just not something that, whether it's in our context, the state or the philanthropic community, kind of, they've come around, but it was something that we were challenged by, and we kind of learned to handle. And a part of that is involving funders as true partners from the onset. So really, getting their input, asking them to participate in different ways, where it's not just, people kind of pitching to them, but really for them to listen, for them to gain clarity and focus for what the needs are, and add their voice into these conversations. So that was something that we also just, we didn't sort of turn to them when we needed something. We were always kind of inviting them in at every opportunity. Having a network fund was for mini grants to kind of catalyze projects before they were able to get more funding, is another, I think, really powerful piece to consider. And I think is also just a way to create also some equity for entities that, traditionally don't get access to larger funding pools or can't get there until they have some seed money. So that's been a really powerful tool for us. And then, and then encouraging external funding sources to use the common agenda, to use the plan as a part of their grant making criteria, to kind of really integrate and institutionalize the plan in other ways, has been an effective thing that we've done. For network culture, I think it's really important to really document everything kind of for transparency, but also for clarity and in kind of expressing how things are done to new members. And so that everyone sort of understands how it works, and we can build then a culture around this notion of networked work. And a part of that too is that, having really clear roles, norms, responsibilities, values, processes, language that you use, being consistent with those things. We have all sorts of documents covering those things that over the years we've worked on and refined. Supporting leadership development and actually, I think, cultivating leadership. So not just looking kind of to the EDs of organizations, but really trying to look to people in programmatic roles and giving them opportunities to grow. And I think then that in turn, organizations kind of see us as an important partner in helping develop their organizations and their leadership capacity. Being data-driven, I think, has been huge, and integrating assessment and measurement into the work. But of course, tell stories. You've got to touch the emotional kind of components as well, and share credit. And that's kind of the image there of, looking sort of differentiating between ego and eco is sharing credit sometimes doesn't look impressive, but in actuality, it's the right thing to do, and it's the thing that is the sustainable thing to do. And then, I feel like this group probably doesn't need to hear it, but celebrate, eat good food together. That's what our gathering is, our annual kind of event is all about. Let me see, I think I'm like 1 or 2 slides away here. So key takeaways for network leadership and kind of the backbone. Again, encourage shared leadership and developing structures for decentralized decision-making. Learning how to, the backbone organization is looked to kind of hold the whole and connect the dots. We're the weaver, the systems thinker, and that can be a very challenging role to be in, but it's definitely one that, network members, they have a very specific context and experience of the food system and also of the network. And so it's really important on us to kind of be able to help them see the bigger picture. And then modeling the behavior that we want to see, and how we want others to kind of show up. That's where promoting transparency and trust and sharing credit, all of those things are really critical in kind of establishing a culture that then starts to permeate beyond the network and within organizations. Also, prototype and design thinking has kind of been a big element of our work. We often talk about fail forward fast. So let's try something and learn from it, and that's okay. Like it's okay to make some mistakes, and that's also where the network fund, having some kind of smaller funding, can help stimulate that learning and those projects in ways that leads to actually some significant, some larger and more significant projects. And then practice early wins to build those deeper relationships needed to do the harder work. So there are some things that, like, you might identify that are, they're kind of the low hanging fruit that establishes confidence in what the network is and what it can do. And then that image there is just kind of, those are all the roles that the backbone plays, of the convener, the facilitator, the coordinator, the weaver. It's a very multifaceted responsibility. And lastly, these are just key frameworks that I think that will stick with us regardless of sort of how our next plan looks and how we change our network. Is that the first triangle, connectivity, alignment, action, is very much understanding the different stages of network activity and specific groups. So in our first 1 to 3 years, it was a lot about connectivity. It was just getting people together, establishing trust, sharing information, because people didn't know kind of what was going on. And that's a distinct function, and that's a distinct activity that sometimes I think we overlook and undervalue. And then from there, oftentimes you can get to aligning around common purpose, common goals, strategies, and actions. And then once you're aligned, the action that you take is oftentimes more effective. And so it's that kind of notion of go slow to go fast. And that's also speaks to, I think, when you're talking about kind of the funding component, is like that first 1 to 3 years of the network is very much kind of that relationship building, which people then are like, well, where's the output? and I can say that it comes. You get to that stage of then people are trusting of each other, they can align around common purpose, and then they're acting in very strategic ways. And then the second one there is kind of an iteration of this, is just like there's these dimensions of success that you've got to balance between establishing relationships, having good process, and then having actual results. Like you do need to get something done and demonstrate that you're being effective, but it also is reliant on balancing out the process and relationships. And then the last piece is kind of it's sometimes referred to as PIMLA. That's like, this is like a design thinking thing, is that you have a plan, you start to implement it, you monitor what's happening, and then you learn it and adjust from that, and then you re-enter the cycle. And this cycle is working at both the small scale and the kind of macro scale. So it could be happening within a particular group and the way it's conducting itself, and then it's happening broadly for our network. And this is kind of a preview of maybe a future presentation, but we're at this point where we're now planning again. We have a new strategic plan that's in process, that's very close to being complete, and we're aiming to deliver it to the legislature in February. And so yeah, we have this whole new kind of cycle to begin anew in 2021, which we're really excited about. So there it is in a nutshell.
Wow, that was absolutely amazing, Jake. I think we'll all agree that's you've done an incredible job there, capturing 10 years of achievement, of work, of networking, of relationship building, planning and implementation. Yeah, you've captured and shared so much in about 50 minutes. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. And yeah, can't wait to hear what Sarah's got to say next week about the municipal planning processes and the links to food security and access, and then going more into public procurement in the third webinar. But there's been a lot of great discussions and questions. Maybe let Jake and Sarah have a look at those ones, if there's any that can be dealt with. As Sarah's already done a couple in writing, we'll leave the discussion for later, and I'll just go ahead now and introduce Holly and have the Australian perspective, a little snapshot of what's happening in different parts of Australia before we have a plenary discussion for the last half hour or so. So yeah, so now I'd like to welcome and introduce to you Holly Jones. Holly is the Senior Public Health Nutritionist from the Tasmanian Department of Health and Human Services. She currently works within Public Health Services, supporting Tasmania's position on public health nutrition matters in the food regulatory system. Most of her working life has been at the intersection of health and social policy and programming, working with the Australian Red Cross on local, state and national food security responses, including policy and advocacy. And despite well-known background, working in Timor-Leste alongside a fiercely clever and committed group of women running a malnutrition rehabilitation centre, while also completing a Master of Public Health, has led Holly to be deeply interested in the whole food system and the processes and politics that shape who eats what. Holly is a public health nutritionist striving for a healthier, more fair food system that everyone can enjoy without costing the earth. So big welcome to Holly. You hopefully are able to share your screen and tell us a bit about what you are doing in Tasmania.
Thanks so much, Nick. I'm trying to share my screen, but I think it's telling me that
Jake, yeah, so hopefully...
So I mistakenly hit the
if
wrong
you're able
button.
to stop sharing, Jake, then Holly will be able to.
Okay, yeah, here we go. Sorry.
Yeah, no
Thank
worries.
you.
Okay.
Great. All right, so thanks so much, Jake, and also to Sarah, Nick and Ariana and the team who've helped make this possible. I want to start by acknowledging the Muanina people, the first people of the land that I'm standing on, Lutruwita, which we know as Tasmania, and I understand who have understood sustainable food systems, and their deep understanding means that they've survived and thrived here for tens of thousands of years prior to colonisation. Today, my plan is to give a brief response to what Jake and Sarah would generously shared and speak about some of the parallels in the Tasmanian experience so far and pose some questions for what might come next. After hearing from Jake, there's so much to like and envy about Farm to Plate, but if I had to choose one thing, what stands out to me is the way that the Farm to Plate plan works to support the economic viability of local farms and increasing food access for all people at the same time. I think a lot of us on the line probably know that both are really important for economic stability and for thriving communities, but they're so often treated as being very separate and sometimes even conflicting objectives. I'm really impressed by how your plan's been able to embed food system development as a key component of Vermont's overall economic growth strategy. And I would imagine that that's a reflection of the importance that you place on and the care that you take with your engagement and governance aspects, which you've shared today. Having that network of over 300 stakeholders is really impressive, and I think most people on the line would really think that gaining that level of commitment across sectors is truly impressive. So I'd heard things about Vermont over the years, but to be honest, I'd never really dug into the detail until earlier this year when we were preparing for what we thought was going to be Jake's visit, and I was looking into good practice around food system strategies and trying to better understand institutional food procurement. I was really interested in how it all began and the development process and the really wide food system scope that you took. But to be honest, I wondered how transferable it was to our island context in Tasmania. And then the more I learned about Vermont, I saw similarities with Tasmania around population, size, geography, and short growing season. And then I read about a list of products being dairy, potatoes, apples, hemp, and hops. And I thought, yeah, I'm going to pay more attention to this because that could have been a Tasmanian list. The only thing missing was salmon. And a particular parallel that's relevant today is that Tasmania's already had 2 different 10-year food system policies and is maybe a lesser known pioneer in a food system approach across the other side of the world. So as far back as 1994, we had a Tasmanian food and nutrition policy, which was developed in partnership between private industry, non-government organisations, government departments and the community. It was at the forefront of national and even international action in food and nutrition action. So at a time when most strategies in this field aim to improve health and wellbeing with nutrition-based activities through a health system, Tasmania took a food systems approach, incorporating primary production through to consumption. And importantly, it acknowledged how food was central to the health and wellbeing of the community, the environment, and the economy. A particular achievement under this 1994 strategy was the development of Eat Well Tasmania, which is a superpowered community service organisation still going strong today, promoting healthy food culture of enjoying local seasonal produce. It's probably not dissimilar to Vermont has the Rooted in Vermont program, but a little bit different. We don't have fried squirrel legs or bear sausages promoted through ours, which is what I've read about in preparing for today. The second iteration of the policy spanned 2004 to 2014, and it was led through the Health and Human Services Department again, with the foundation of a food systems approach and engagement across that same group. It was another bold attempt, and Tasmania was still the only Australian jurisdiction to have a whole of system food and nutrition policy when it was reviewed in its midterm in 2009. It set a vision for Tasmania as a state which produces quality, healthy, safe and affordable food while sustaining the natural environment, strengthening the local economy, a community empowered to make food choices that enhance health and well-being. It covered 12 areas as opposed to Vermont's 25. Particular achievements under this policy that have made a lasting impact on Tasmania's food system are things like the Shellfish Quality Assurance Program, the Food Security Council and associated strategy, and the Agri-Growth Scorecard. And the most recent one of those came out last week, showing an agricultural farm gate value of $1.9 billion for Tasmania. It was a period when the financial crisis, water access, climate change, globalisation of the food supply, and the rising prevalence of diet-related chronic diseases all had an impact, and these remain to be prominent challenges in our work today. A point from the review which really sticks with me as someone working in this space at the moment was how stakeholders felt that the policy would be of most value so long as it was backed by ongoing commitment to its coordination, promotion and implementation. I suppose it's one thing to have a really strong food systems-based policy, but it's another to have the resources and the commitment to truly implement it with shared engagement and a sense of responsibility across all the sectors in the way that it's intended, which is why I'm so interested in the governance arrangements for Farm to Plate. 2014 seems like a long time ago now. In fact, January feels like a long time ago. So while the window of redeveloping the strategy hasn't exactly been wide open, there's still been an impressive breadth of activity in this area. A variety of vibrant community sector organisations run by enthusiastic champions make an enormous contribution in their fields, and many of them are online today. And they also perform the role of being effective advocates to government on behalf of the communities that they represent. And you'll hear from some of them throughout the series. Under our current Healthy Tasmania strategy in the food and nutrition arm, there's an impressive and diverse range of food system projects happening across the state. The challenge is to find ways that we can sustainably resource those kinds of initiatives when they have a longer term role and vision. So hopefully the picture that I have painted for you here is that Tasmania has a really solid foundation and the skills, networks and determination to rise to food system challenges of the future. If you fast forward through to today, in December 2020, the COVID pandemic helped us realise some really hard food system truths for Tasmania. They were probably always there, but they're much clearer now. The role of our food system in the health of the community and economy was right in our faces, from handwritten signs down on the docks selling crayfish that would normally be exported at a premium, favourite community cafes closing down in what seemed like overnight, leaving producers having to find a new market for their harvest, and ongoing questions over how we'll have enough pickers and packers for this summer's berry and cherry crop. So hospitality looks different now. There are a whole lot of new farm to consumer direct sales options. People are using digital means to find out more about their local food supply. We've got farmers markets with drive-through options and places like school canteens pivoting to meet the challenge. The groundswell of engagement in these solutions-focused activities, people are doing things differently. And this was really well matched by consumer preferences of wanting to know more about what their food supply and being able to buy and eat locally. It's really highlighted that there's an opportunity to build back better in Tasmania. There's an opportunity to ensure a world-class sustainable agri-food system that provides meaningful jobs across our regions, strong seasonal and local food culture that drives healthy consumption locally, as well as a vibrant food tourism sector. So I'll start to wrap this up now by posing a few questions. What could it look like if we really did embed health and food in all policies and hit the sweet spot of co-benefits across health, social, economic and environmental outcomes by doing so? And could there ever be a better time to start genuinely engaging with Tasmanians again to develop the next 10-year food and nutrition strategy, informed through the strong foundations based on local experience, with a pinch of the flavour of what we're learning from our colleagues in Vermont? I really hope that the story that I've shared today, alongside some enticing images of Tasmanian produce, has been interesting for the panel and also everyone who's joined us. We're really hoping for an ongoing conversation with the team in Vermont, as well as other food system champions across Australia. And I'm really looking forward to the rest of the series. So thanks again for the opportunity.
Fantastic.
That I acknowledge the teams of people and the years and years of work that's gone behind what I've quickly shared today. So in particular, Judy Seal and Julie Williams, a team here at Public Health Services, and also champions outside of government. And there are so many, but I particularly like to acknowledge Leah Galvin and Sandy Murray, who initiated Tasmania's involvement with the Vermont series. And they continue to ask the questions and provoke inspiration and action.
Great, thanks very much, Holly. That was fantastic to have that overview of the work that's been happening in Tasmania for the last, going back to 1994, so nearly 30 years now. Great to have that context and history. And yeah, I was talking to Sandy earlier in the week, and I hear there's exciting things afoot as well right now in the wake of COVID. So that's really fantastic and really great to have your support and involvement in this series. So now I'd like to introduce Oral Maguire and Alan Beattie, who are going to share with us some of their work at the Noongar Land Enterprise Group. So Oral Maguire is the principal consultant of Hyundai Consulting. He's a Southwest Noongar man. He brings cultural knowledge of the land and forest, which has been shared through Noongar stories, songlines and beliefs of the flora and fauna, as well as a full appreciation of Noongar significant and sacred places and sites. Oral has 18 years experience as professional firefighter, and for the past 11 years has been practicing cultural burning on his 2,100 acre property, where he and his family are transforming the land back to its natural state. Their vision is to plant 1 million trees and to create a Noongar cultural sanctuary. Oral is a prominent Noongar community leader, landholder and long-term champion of Aboriginal economic empowerment and capacity building with specific experience in traditional land and fire management practices. He has vast knowledge and experience in government, private enterprise and the not-for-profit sector, and a proven track record in bridging the divide between mainstream and Aboriginal communities. And Alan, who will be speaking with him, Alan Beattie is the CEO of the Noongar Land Enterprise Group, the NLE. Alan is a recognised industry leader, having held a number of senior roles in government, the not-for-profit and private sector since 1997. 2013, Alan was awarded the Asia Pacific Enterprise Corporation Leadership Award, Social Service Award. So a very warm welcome to Oral and Alan.
Lovely, thank you, Nick. And thanks to all the organisers for, and Sustain obviously, for the opportunity to be a part of the forum. I think it's these forums, particularly post the beginning of COVID, I think has caused us all to be able to connect in different ways, and Zoom and Teams have provided these forums for us to do that on a global scale. So it's great to be here. Hello to everyone wherever you may be in the world. Look, the NLE is an enterprise group. We're a culturally based group. The Noongar region, our tribal and traditional lands, make us the biggest, both geographically and demographically, the biggest cultural group in Australia amongst the 300 nations of First Nations people here in Australia. We commenced a group, so all of us are landholders, all of our members. There's probably about a collective of close to 50 potential members. At the moment, we're only 8 members, but we manage a collective land mass of about 20,000 hectares. Those principles around the partnerships and our collective and collaborative ways are very much culturally based, and the diversity is not just in the lands that we represent as cultural groups within our Noongar Budja landholding group and cultural group, but also in the diversity of our enterprises and aspirations to, I guess, to maximise our benefits and to replicate a lot of what we've been and where we've come from. Excuse me, as cultural people, as Noongar people. Look, my view is that, and listening to, and thank you, Jake and Holly, for your great presentations. I think so much came out of what you were saying. I'm actively involved in a lot of groups, including Regen WA here in Australia, or here in Western Australia. The regenerative ag movement, I think, is a fantastic shift, but I think it's only a shift. It's not the quantum leap that I think we must really consider. And I think the answers for sustainable models, and I think the whole model of sustainability, or the aspiration to achieve sustainability, particularly around food production and obviously our natural resources management, comes from Indigenous groups globally. As Indigenous peoples and first lands, first holders of law and society around the globe, we are the original affluent societies. So here in Australia, nothing has been brought to this country that replicates anything of our sustainability model. So we hold, as Indigenous peoples around the globe, I think, to be totally frank and honest, the only sustainability models for food production and for health and well-being in a holistic sense. So this map represents Noongar Budja. It's a collective landmass of about 200,000 square kilometres. So Jake, your little addition of Vermont into the the landscape of our countries. I think if you look at the inset map there, I think you'd be struggling to be the size of Wajak Budja, which is the metropolitan area of Perth. I'm sitting here on Ballarong Budja, and I also have strong ties into Wajak. But we are, our lands are big. Australia's a big country, and our lands of the Noongar. Our Noongar peoples represents that 200,000 square kilometres, which covers that whole southwest corner. And just to give you some context, the drive from Esperance, our Esperance Mob Jalyarak, up to Bimara in Yuat country up in the north is probably about an 800-kilometre drive. So you're still both in the state, but you're also still on a lot of tribal law and tribal lands of the Noongar people. So our membership on that map, you can see we've got our 8 members. As I said, we represent about a 20,000 hectare landmass. And we have, if I could just go forward, thank you, Ariana. We have a model that I think the challenge for us is representing, and Alan will finish up the presentation, but this model very much, as we can, we'd like to represent what we've got in the middle of that diagram, our challenge of being commercially focused and culturally appropriate. Now that's our governance model, and they're our principles. Our structure is to the left. Our membership is also listed there. But we absolutely pursue our models in terms of our enterprise development around a very fundamental principle that, and of course our protocols of caring for country, that actually, I guess, it comes out in the way we think about land and country, in that country is medicine. So our bush produce terminology is about what country allows us to sustain ourselves with that natural and endemic species of both flora and fauna. In our country alone, we have over 9,000 species of 5,500 to 6,000 species of plants alone that make up our bush foods market, if you like, marketplace. So trying to not exploit, it's probably the wrong word, but trying to capitalise on our cultural ways as being the oldest living culture. The Southwest is a biodiversity hotspot, a global biodiversity hotspot. as I said, we've got potentially 9,000 to 10,000 species of plants and animals that sustained ourselves as Noongar people, and of course as Aboriginal people across Australia, and then Indigenous groups right across the world, in a way that I don't think humans have replicated in any way. So our vision and our philosophy is that country is medicine, and that cultural food is a critical part of ourselves as Indigenous peoples. And in terms of food sustainability, in terms of caring for country, in terms of land management, all of those things represent, all of those aspects represent a way that Indigenous people see ourselves both in our country, on our country, and also how we sustain ourselves as human beings. So these are models that we certainly, we've got to be very careful about exploiting our sacred knowledge. We have a principle of aligning sacred knowledge with scientific knowledge. So we use very contemporary and modern agricultural, land management and environmental practices to maintain country. We're also dealing with, you know, a big issue of colonisation for us mobs around the world. Our foods are problems for us in terms of how we sustain ourselves and our models for land enterprise, for food production, and for our spiritual cultural existence as peoples. So our models are premised on this fundamental here, this fundamental diagram, which drives, you know, the enterprises or the products that we hope to produce. They include everything from nguka honey, our traditional bush foods, produce obviously a diversity of plants. Those plants attract, you know, enormous species. The biodiversity of Australia is, you know, these foods, these animals and plants and birds, they all interact with each other, creating what we call cultural food. So there is no surprise when you think about Indigenous foods around the globe. And I think a documentary that I watched the other day that I think I'd highly recommend, it was, geez, what was it called? It was called Gather. Now, Gather is a documentary about Native Americans and everything that they spoke about in there, including the healthy alternative to cattle and beef that the buffalo offers the Native Americans, is absolutely aligned to and in line with our view of our Indigenous foods here. Marsupials, particularly the kangaroo, is potentially and arguably the most healthy meat, red meat in the world. And that's because these animals, like the buffalo, eat these native species. All of our species, the 6,000 to 9,000 species of plants, are superfoods, if you like. So we know that the bush produce or the bush foods industry as a marketplace is currently in Australia, a $20 million, so it's relatively small, but an Aboriginal participation in that industry is actually less than 1%. So we have 99% of non-Aboriginal people exploiting cultural knowledge of Indigenous foods. So we as a Noongar Land Enterprise Group certainly want to address that. We aim to manage our lands better. As Nick introduced, on our property here, we're turning a really run down, damaged wheat sheep farm as my family and with the enterprise that we're operating into a sacred site where biodiversity and country is returned back to. And that starts with back to its natural state, and that starts with planting or a vision to plant 1 million trees, and we're about halfway. So bringing spirituality back to country is about the biodiversity. We as Indigenous peoples around the globe, and science needs to understand this, that we are actually part of the biodiversity that everybody talks about. You cannot have a biodiverse ecology or system without the Indigenous peoples and the traditional owners and the custodians of all the lands that we've, and I thank everybody for acknowledging those lands that you are sitting on. but the indigenous peoples and the custodians and the traditional owners of those lands are part of the biodiversity and therefore a key to the health and well-being of country and the foods and the produce that we make. So a central piece of our work is absolutely putting Buja first, putting country first. And I would encourage all of you to think about what that means, because as I said in my welcome, in our language, we say, Buja. Now that means that land, this country, the land that we sit on, is our mother, and we must care for her in such a way that she provides for us. So we cannot exploit country, we cannot exploit our natural resources and our environment and then think that we can achieve sustainability. It is not possible and it is not doable in any matter. So I challenge everybody to think about the inputs that Indigenous groups bring. I think if we're going to develop models where we feed the world and we feed people better, then the models that Indigenous groups are developing and have had access to for thousands of generations, like us mob here in Australia, then we must put some value into that knowledge. And so these are the things, I guess, these are the pursuits that the Noongar Land Enterprise is pursuing. So I'll hand over to Alan now and he can finish off. Thank you.
Okay, if we can just move on to the next slide. Thanks, Ariana, and thanks, Oral, for that, and thanks, Sustain, for the opportunity for us to present here today. Just very quickly, the Noongar Land Enterprise Group is Australia's first Aboriginal grower group, and it was established for a range of reasons, and some of those are there in relation to things such as having a scalability, a marketing platform, information exchange for the various members, etc. And if we move on to the next slide, I'm just going to whip through some of these. There's also, apart from the economic side of things, there's also a range of more social benefits as well, through to not only the members but the broader Noongar community here in the southwest of Western Australia. So and the broader non-Noongar community as well, the Wodjila community, and the sharing of the history and the culture of the Noongar people. So there's I think one of the key things here from an NLE perspective is, and Oral's mentioned it here, is the very deep connection between the people themselves and the country, and the healing that can take place in relation to that, where we're able to use the properties that we have in order to be able to, for the benefit of not only the NLE members themselves and their families, but the broader Noongar community, and dealing with a whole range of social and economic considerations that have developed over since white man has settled in this country. Just on the next slide, just going to touch upon a few of the key sort of projects that we are working on currently, and one in particular on the next slide. Oral's mentioned a couple of these. If we just go back that one slide, thanks. The Nooka Honey project is a project whereby we're developing it as a collective. We've currently got around about 100 hives out on the various properties. Not quite at the stage yet of having commercial production size, but hopefully that will occur sometime within the next 12 months. And it's something that is through the scalability of various properties, we're able we'll be able to get to a commercial quantity size. With the wattle seed, and that sort of links in as well with the third one there, the Orange Bar project, which is focused on bush foods, and wattle seed being one of those bush foods. And we're focusing initially on the wattle seed, one, for a few reasons. One, it's from an IP perspective, and Oral spoke about this in relation to the cultural knowledge, is that, you know, wattle seed is something that is already out there in the marketplace, in the public domain, etc. So it's not we're not divulging any cultural intellectual property considerations, etc. We also, in particular through Oral's property, but through our various properties, have a sizable acacia wattle seed plantations already on those various properties, and so we're currently about to commence our first major wattle seed wild harvest collection, and that would have taken place a week or so ago, but unlike the East Coast, we've had very cool weather here in Western Australia lately, and so that's been delaying that wattle seed, first major wattle seed collection. And the Yordinge Bar project is a whole range of initiatives that we're looking at from the bush foods industry side of things, and not only how does NLE, but how do other Aboriginal people and grower groups around Australia get a greater slice of that 1% currently of the bush foods industry in Australia. And we certainly working on things so that we're a part of that economic journey moving forward in the bush foods area. On to the next slide. And with all those projects and all the projects we're looking at, what it provides is it provides diversification for our various member entities, so that a number of them have already got various businesses up and running, etc. But it provides a diversification of those of their income. It provides employment and income opportunities for not only those members but the broader Noongar community. It allows the utilisation of the land that's occupied by or held by the various landowners in a whole range of different ways. There's the cultural rejuvenation that I spoke of, the upskilling of a whole range of different skills for people, and in particular the scalability that we can get through having this cooperative sort of venture between the various NLE members, so that we can get continuity of supply and also good market opportunities. The last, if we move on to the last slide, the big news, I suppose, from an NLE perspective is over the past 3 months, we've been able to negotiate and acquire the purchase of a tree farm nursery, approximately 5 kilometres Perth side of Northern, for those who are familiar with Western Australia. This was a nursery that was in the process of, tree nursery that was in the process of closing down, not because of lack of opportunities and markets and that sort of thing, but because Lou is in his 70s and has decided that it's time for him to retire. And so the tree nursery very much fits in with our caring for country philosophy. So that whole notion of commercially sustainable and culturally appropriate, we saw this very, very firmly fitted into. The nursery itself has the capacity for producing approximately 3 million seedlings per year. We've been already able to, over the past month, secure orders of approximately 1.5 million seedlings, which we're furiously in the process of planting now. And we were able to sort of finance this, the purchase of this through philanthropic funding, interestingly, mainly from out of Europe, and also some impact investment funding that we've been able to secure here in Australia. So this has all happened pretty quickly, and we've just taken over operations of it in mid-November. We've got currently around about 70,000 of the 1.5 million seedlings planted. And we're going to be very busy leading up to Christmas in relation to getting this off the ground. But this is really a game changer for NLE as an organisation, and provides us with real financial sustainability moving forward, but also in a culturally appropriate way, where that we can work with a whole range of regenerative practice organisations, but also assist our own members with introducing bush food species back onto their own properties. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks so much, Alan and Oral. Congratulations on the work that you and your colleagues have achieved with the short time that NLE has been in existence. It's a really fantastic initiative and fundamentally important, and it's great to see the progress that you're making. Yeah, just want to thank you, Oral, for as I mentioned in the chat there, the fundamentally important truths that you shared with us in terms of the, sustainability and what it means, and the fact that First Nations peoples have been living here for tens of thousands of years and managing the land and its diverse creatures sustainably, and that is really, where the foundation of true sustainability, both in terms of food systems and more broadly in society, must be based on. And thank you very much for reminding us of that. So now finally, And I've seen that people have been having their questions answered, and thanks very much to Jake and Sarah for going through and doing that. So keep please putting questions in. But finally, I'm going to invite Pieter, who I've had the great pleasure of working with for a number of years now in the Cardinia Food Circles project, a joint initiative between Cardinia Shire Council and Sustain and many others, a collective impact food systems project. So Pieter is a public health planner and dietitian with 9 years experience working in both the community health and local government sectors. She's currently leading the social and community planning team at Cardinia Shire Council and has developed the key strategic documents such as Cardinia Shire's Livability Plan and Cardinia's Community Food Strategy. Pieter is passionate about working with communities, government and institutions to create a healthy, delicious, sustainable and fair food systems for all and help to establish the Cardinia Food Circles Collective Impact Project. So over to you, Pieter.
Thank you, Nick. And I just want to check you can see my screen. It's a full screen slide. Fantastic, thank you. And thank you to everyone that's presented earlier. It's been so wonderful to hear about all the other work that's been happening across Australia and particularly in Vermont. I think we can definitely say we've taken inspiration from the work in Vermont for the Cardinia Food Circles project. And I also just wanted to do a quick shout out to all of the Food Circles partners that are online today. I've seen that there's quite a few of you here, so it's really fantastic, and I'm very honoured to be presenting about this on behalf of the entire group. So before I get started, I would like to acknowledge that Cardinia Shire Council is on the traditional lands of the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to the elders, both past, present and emerging. And to give you a bit of information about where Cardinia Shire is located, we're 50 kilometres southeast of the Melbourne CBD. We're considered an interface council in that we're located right on the fringe of the metropolitan border and where that meets regional Victoria. We're a growth council with currently just over 100,000 people, but that's due to double in the next 20 years, with 7 families moving in each day. The Shire consists of 27 townships across 3 distinct regions. So we have a hills area in the north, which is part of the Dandenong Ranges, a growth corridor in the centre of the Shire, and then the flats, which sort of surrounds Western Port. And this is a significant agricultural area for our Shire. So a question that I have been asked a few times over the years is, what does food have to do with local government? And I guess I have been working in food and local government for a few years now, so this question does pop up. But I think really there's strong acknowledgement that local government plays many roles in food, from an economic role, a health and wellbeing role, food waste, and climate and the environment, just to name some. For us, our work in the food system really is driven through our livability plan, which brings together our work under our Public Health and Wellbeing Act, and also land use planning and the work that's driven through Plan Melbourne around increasing livability. So the work that we're doing really has a focus, I guess, on those health outcomes for our community. And the challenge that we're facing and that's really driven this approach has been the low consumption of fruit and vegetables that we see in our community, the high rates of nutrition-related ill health that's really a result of this. Many parts of the Shire have limited access to nutritious food. That's the availability, the transport to access food, and as well as the cost. We have a really high density of fast food outlets, particularly in the growth corridor. And we're also seeing a loss of viable farmland to housing and development. So as I mentioned, we are a growth council, so significant portions of what was farming land is now suburbs. And we also are very conscious and aware of the changing climate for us as a Shire, but as the whole of Australia and the world. We really feel those effects. In the last 2 years, we've had major bushfires, we've had floods, and now a pandemic. And we're already back into that phase of preparing for bushfire season again. So these all have significant impacts on our food system. So we know we have some pretty big challenges to address, and we know that council cannot address this alone. And we decided that we really needed to take a collective impact approach to addressing some of these challenges. Council has some resources, but certainly not enough to be addressing this by ourselves. So one of the first things we did was look to establish a backbone support for the project, and we partnered with Sustain to be our backbone for the Food Circles project. One of the first things we did was sign the Urban and Regional Food Declaration, and that's a picture of Nick and our previous mayor after signing that. So that was a really sort of strong initial commitment to taking this collective approach. So once we'd sort of established our backbone and kind of agreed on this approach, we really set about creating some really strong engagement with the community around our food system. Between 2017 and 2018, we held 3 initial community workshops, one in the north of the Shire, one in the central part of the Shire, and one in the south. And from there, we did a call out and invited people to form what is now the Cardinia Food Movement with many, many members across the Shire. Through those initial workshops and the establishment of the food movement, we were able to recruit and train a group of local volunteers who became our kitchen table conversation facilitators. And they really were a key part of us engaging with the broader community around our food system. So we delivered a huge number of kitchen table conversations across the Shire. So this was in cafes, in people's homes, in workplaces, churches, anywhere that would take us really, and anywhere that these people really had access to. We did reach quite a few people through this process, but we also recognised that particularly in the Shire, there's a lot of challenges with transport and other accessibility issues. So we also did an online campaign called #IdeasHarvest, where we invited people across the whole Shire, including school children, to submit their ideas and thoughts around how we could improve the food system. And then following all of this, we presented all of the data back to a number of really key stakeholders that we saw in the food system to start to workshop what are the main things that we want to be addressing from this consultation and from what we're hearing from the community. So this really led to us creating our common agenda, which is to create a healthy, delicious, sustainable and fair food system for all Cardinia Shire residents. And this became the vision for our community food strategy that was launched in February 2019. And the food strategy has 5 key goals or areas that we want to be focusing on. And that includes protecting and utilising our fertile land, growing a vibrant local food economy, enhancing food knowledge, skills and culture, reverting and diverting food waste from landfill and reusing water to grow food, and importantly, building capacity across the community to lead, participate in and support this food system change. So you can see just a few of the people that came along to the launch of the food strategy back in 2019 there. So it was very much about bringing the community back and hearing the results of the consultation and sitting out and starting to activate some of their ideas for action. So I guess within the food strategy, there's also an associated action plan, and that really documents these mutually reinforcing activities. And this is what we talk about in collective impact, where we have many, many activities that are happening across the Shire, some of which started well before the Food Circles project, but we wanted to bring them together under this umbrella of a common agenda and really align those objectives. A number of activities have also started since the inception of the Food Circles project, which is fantastic. But these are really just a couple of them. So we have an overarching steering group for the project, and then a range of different working groups, such as a food hub working group, farmers market working group, farmland advocacy working group. And so they all oversee a range of different actions and activities. So this is a really important part of the project. This is really where the doing gets done. And ultimately what we want to see is more and more of this beehive growing and growing over time, where we see more activities that are aligned to the common agenda. So I am sort of reaching the end of the presentation. I think I'll probably rush through a little bit, just knowing the time that we've got. But I just do want to talk to you a little bit about some of the lessons that we've learned and some of the things that we're still exploring. We're only about 4 years into the project, so it was great to hear from Jake, and knowing that their initiatives has been going for over 10 years now. I think we are still very much in that stage of building relationships and trust, and we're just starting to move really into that strong action stage at the moment, which is fantastic. We're starting to see some of those projects that have been bubbling away for many years really starting to come, really starting to activate, which is fantastic. I think some of the lessons that we've learned, and we've talked about this at the partnership steering group, is balancing the need to have a common agenda that's both aspirational and achievable, so that you can get that sense of achieving things over time. That bringing together diverse groups of people for a shared purpose takes time to create that trust and build that shared understanding of what the challenges are. Our system and context is always changing, particularly this year with the pandemic and bushfires and many other competing priorities for all of our partner organisations and community in terms of their focus and what we have energy to be working on. I think a challenge that we found, particularly I think in local government, is compared to issues such as, for example, family violence, which has a really strong focus at a state government level, funding, policies. We don't have something like that to leverage off at a local level. So having something like that, I think, would take this to the next level. We also do find challenges in accessing data to quantify change, particularly a lot of that economic data, employment data for our food system. When we're looking more at the agricultural side of things, sometimes that data is quite difficult to access, as well as identifying those sort of longer term funding streams. So we are quite heavily reliant on some short-term grants at the moment for the work. As much as council has invested long-term a portion of the funding, it's certainly not enough to really cover what we need to be achieving under this collective impact approach. But some of the really great opportunities that come from collective impact and through this project have been the ability of multiple groups tackling the same problems from different angles. And I think having really diverse perspectives from different organisations, different community members, also creates sort of greater leverage. If you've got government, community, organisations all saying the same thing, it does give us a stronger voice when we are applying for funding or looking for other partners to come on board. I think something that's been really great is seeing funders and partners using their influence, not just through money, but through relationships to actually create some of this change and to identify new opportunities for the work that we're doing. And I think, just jumping down to the bottom there, I think such an important part of this work in using collective impact is around having that consistent messaging and a clear call to action. I think there's been a huge amount of work that's happened in our food system over many years through a number of different initiatives, but having something that's really localised and consistent that can last a long time, I think is really important and a great opportunity through collective impact and having this common agenda. So I would like to acknowledge that we do have a number of partner organisations and volunteers that are working towards the Food Circle's common agenda, and obviously this couldn't be done without them. Local government is one player, and we really value and acknowledge the support of everyone who's working on this project. We're really hoping to see some improved health outcomes for our community in the next 8 years. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Pieta. Yeah, just speaking personally from my involvement over many years now with Cardinia Shire Council, it's been really terrific to work with you and your colleagues there for on this project. It's a really great initiative. It's really trying to get to grips with some really difficult entrenched issues, as we know. But it's, I think it reinforces the experience that Jake spoke about, that this is a long-term process. It is about relationships. It is about partnerships, and you have to be patient. But I think the point you made about supporting structures and frameworks from the state level is really important, and I think we have lacked that in Victoria. But we're going to hear from Melanie Chisholm next week to talk about some great leadership and work that Vic Health have been doing at a state level in Victoria in the context of the COVID pandemic, and formulating a consensus statement for a really ambitious but realisable program for food systems reform in Victoria. So yeah, great that Vic Health have been stepping into that space and facilitating an emerging network at the state level. So very excited to see where that can go. Thank you. So yeah, thanks to everybody for staying. Thanks again to everybody for the contributions. We have had a lot of questions. Jake and others have done an amazing job. Sarah, thank you for answering all those as they've come up. I noticed that a lot of them have been answered, but there are still some that are remaining. And I'm sure there's, you know, some other, just some kind of like, you know, final reflections and broader issues that we can perhaps invite panelists and speakers to share. Maybe if we indulge everyone for perhaps a further 10 minutes past 1 o'clock, if that's all right, to deal with these questions, maybe 15 minutes of discussion, and then we'll wrap up and look forward to seeing you all back again next week. So Ariana and George, can you let us know if there's particular questions that haven't been answered? I know Alan particularly wanted to answer one live.
Sure. Alan, did you want to answer that question first? Or is Alan still with us?
No, it was more a case of, no, I've actually answered it via message now back to that. So that's fine.
Okay.
Okay, great. We just have, most of them, as you said, have been answered, but a few that haven't. Someone from Women's Health in Goulburn North is asking whether, pertaining to what Jake mentioned about the health impacts earlier in his presentation, if there's a way to read more about that or to find out more about that topic.
I'm trying to remember what my reference to health impacts actually was. Kind of provide a coherent response to that.
Okay, no worries. Well, we can review and send that through in the post-webinar wrap up for those who are interested.
I did want to say too that, so Sarah works with our health cross-cutting team and also our food access cross-cutting team. So she might also be in a better position to provide some context to that.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Kelly has a couple of questions.
Sorry, were you going to speak, Sarah? Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think, Jake, so I'm happy to speak to this question too once we have a little bit more, I understand a little bit more what is being asked. Jake, I believe the reference you made to health impacts was other impacts in the healthcare system when you were talking about procurement. I don't know if that rings a bell for others.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, 1 second. Yeah, I think now I know exactly now where that would be. Yeah, so as I mentioned, there was, you know, kind of the Scaling Up Forum led to kind of a similar application to healthcare, and what that led to was some sustained efforts amongst hospitals and support organizations to increase their local procurement. So they were doing things like sharing product lists to help other healthcare entities identify local products. They were sharing buying specs and best practices for utilizing local and meeting their health requirements. And now what that's actually led to is that there's a regional exchange that's been created where healthcare entities can buy from this kind of single exchange, and there are local providers in that exchange now. So their products are available to kind of a larger network of healthcare providers, both in state and in the region. And so that was, you know, there was a lot that happened to kind of get to that point, but that's kind of the place that we're at now, which is really cool.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jake. And I have a question here from Kelly for Pieta. She is wondering what opportunities there are to push developers to develop healthier urban environments through the council's planning scheme.
Yeah, so there's definitely ways that we can work towards that and working with developers, and we do work with quite a few developers in Cardinia Shire, as you imagine. Some of the challenges that we find is that really the planning scheme is written and is delivered through a state level. So some mechanisms we just don't have an ability to change. So that's where I think working with the state government would be a great benefit to actually influence, I guess, those guidelines around precinct structure planning, which we've had some ability to do. I'm definitely not an expert on developer contribution, so I'd have to take that question on notice and get back to you. But we certainly are having many conversations with developers around increasing sort of urban agriculture. That's something we've really been looking at lately. And I think probably a little bit separate, like a little bit to the side of that question is a challenge that we sort of have to overcome in Cardinia, where we've had many sort of community gardens and urban agricultural spaces that have been developed by developers, but when they leave and those sites have been handed over to council, there hasn't been the resourcing to continue to maintain them, and the community activation around those sites hasn't continued once that happens. So there's, I guess, that we need to continue to also work to activate the community to work to be activating those spaces, because otherwise they will sit there unused. So that's something that we're definitely focusing on at the moment. But yeah, the developer contributions, I'd need to get some information and provide that back.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have another question here for Holly. Do you have compliance officers allocated to the Tasmanian Schools Canteen Association who can assist schools implementing a healthy foods canteen policy?
Thanks for the question. I don't work closely with the canteen work, so I couldn't tell you exactly how the model works, but I'm really happy to take contact details, and some of the community dietitians who work really closely with the School Canteens Association can get in touch with the person asking the question. Not so sure about compliance, but we certainly have levels of accreditation that different schools aim to reach.
Okay, thank you.
I have to go to another meeting just now. I'm sorry to leave early. Thanks, it's been wonderful.
Thanks,
Thank you, Holly. All right. I just have one last question. Yep. So for Piata, in case she missed this, how did the plan originate, and was there a motion brought forth to the councillors from the community, or did it start with council officers or managers?
That was for me, sorry. Yeah.
Yes,
yeah, so yes, it came really from, to be honest, they came through our CEO and conversations that he'd had and present and similar, events that he'd been to with Sustain, and he'd sort of seen that we could be doing something more in this space. I think it also really came from the ending of a state government initiative that happened back in, I think it was 2015 or 16. We had been working quite strongly in this space, but unfortunately that initiative finished, and our community and our council really wanted to see that work continuing, and a number of our partners. So we looked at how we could continue that, what could a sort of a more sustainable longer term model look like for our community. And that's where it really came from. Just knowing that at that point in time, there wasn't really a consistent approach through the state government for a long-term vision, and we felt like we needed to sort of do that at a local government level to really address that.
Yeah, and I can just kind of like compliment from our side, from Sustain, that the whole idea of a participatory creation of a community food strategy, which was Peter referred to in her presentation, the kitchen table talks, that was yeah, something that I had been involved in the Australian context with the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance, the People's Food Plan creation back in 2012, 2013. And that was in turn inspired by Canada's People's Food Policy Project, which was led by Food Secure Canada back in 2008, 9, 10. A whole of country approach that was guided by an Indigenous circle of elders to, reimagining and understanding the food system in Canada. And then interesting how these things go in waves, and later in the context of Brexit in the United Kingdom, there was a People's Food Policy Project, a whole of system conversation facilitated by the Land Workers Alliance and the Centre for Agriculture, Water and Resilience at the Coventry University in the Midlands in the UK. So, you know, that kind of history then was again brought to Cardinia Shire with the participatory process that was the kitchen table methodology. So, yeah, so that's just a bit of a history about ideas of food justice and food sovereignty and food democracy and how they flow into, you know, these processes with local government. Okay, I see that people have to leave. We have hit 1 o'clock. It's late over in Vermont. We've had a really fantastic webinar. I've got some questions and things that we can pick up next week. I'm really keen to hear about COVID and what that means for you all over there, and how, you know, the importance and the relationships and the network has allowed you to meet those challenges. But yeah, we've run out of time for today, but really keen to hear about that. And yeah, so looking forward to what you've got to say, Sarah, next week about the municipal planning framework and the tools and processes that you've been working on about that, as well as, yeah, with the second part of next week will be a series of workshops organised on a state basis here in Australia with various breakout rooms. So yeah, just again, a huge thank you to Jake and Sarah, to Oral and Alan, to Pieter, to Holly, to Georgia and Ariana, to everybody involved today, to everybody for attending and participating in this webinar. It's been really fantastic, and very much looking forward to next week and the 16th and hopefully into 2021. I really hope that now we've begun this conversation, this process, that we do stay in touch with you and you know, continue this, you know, relationship across the oceans. And across culture. Yeah, we're learning so much from you, and hopefully that this is really interesting for you as well to, you know, have this deep insight into what's going on in Australia. Yeah, so just if anyone wants to have any final words, we can wrap it up. No? Anyone? No? Okay. All right. All right. Well, then on that basis, yeah, thanks again to everyone. Have a good evening. Have a good day. And yeah, look forward to seeing you back here again next Wednesday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.